He's such a drama. Right. Welcome everybody to the full council meeting, 30th September. Welcome to councillors, EV representatives, Natalia and Kirsten, Tenakwe, community board chairs, staff, and members of the public who may be watching online. Council blessing, I actually asked our EV representatives if they would like to do it, but they said, we want to watch how you fellas do it. So I quickly passed the hot potato to my deputy. I mean, that's what she's here for.
Pressure's on.
It's all yours.
Ia mātou e whiriwhiri ana ina take ke mua I o mātou aro. E pono ana mātou ka kaha tonu ki te whakapau mahara huapai mo na hapori e mahi na mātou. Me kaha hoki mātou katoa ki whaihua. Ki a tōtika te mātou mahi a matamaia te tira whakamua me te hihiri ka taia te arahi I roto I te kotahitanga me te aroha.
Kia ora. How about these, see? Item number 3, apologies. I haven't received any apologies. I know Councillor Randall is on Zoom, so he's here with us. Declarations of interest relating to items on the agenda, I have received none. Public speaking time for items relating to the agenda, item 5, none. Members' business. Public speaking time responses, no. Leave of absence. Councillor Hanford.
The 4th to the 8th of November.
And Councillor Pravanov.
The 2nd to the 5th of October.
Anybody else? Right. I move that leave of absence be accepted. Can I have a seconder? Councillor James Coots. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Carried. Matters of an urgent nature. Nothing. Mayor's report, no. It'll be given the next meeting. Now we're on to the reports. I just need to inform you there's another additional item on the agenda, 8.5, that is the notice of motion by Councillor Compton. Reports. The first one is the adoption of the draft Keeping of Animals, Bees and Poultry Bylaw 2021 on page 6. Who's speaking on it?
We'll just get some of the staff will come down now.
We moved too quickly. See, you should never think the councillors work slowly. In the meantime, Kahu will tell us a story, mate. Until they arrive. I didn't see your name up.
Apologies.
Councillor Elliott.
Your Worship, we appear to have no live stream. The public are ringing. And to say there's no live stream at the moment. Thank you.
Just say all the decisions have been made.
Mr. Mayor, we do have some system problems this morning, so it's possible that our internet is causing this to not work. So even though it's on here, so our apologies, there's probably nothing we can do until the systems are up and running again. Most people can't access their Outlook. And if you can, it's pretty much what it was yesterday. So
it's not just council system, it's general.
No, there is no conspiracy here, Mr. Mayor.
I didn't go there. Just asking. I suppose the COVID seating arrangements makes it a bit difficult. Here we go. It's all yours.
Thanks, guys. So, good morning, Mayor, Councillors and Chief Executive. Today we are discussing the adoption of the draft Keeping of Animals, Bees and Poultry Bylaw 2021. So I've just waddled down.
I noticed that.
So this follows consultation on a draft bylaw in June and July, where we received 56 submissions, and 6 people spoke to their submissions at hearings in August and a later council meeting. Analysis of submissions have identified overall support for the proposals. Some adjustments have been identified and reflected in the recommendations for the adoption of the final version of the 2021 bylaw. So I'm still struggling.
We will now take a 5-minute break.
Capacity. Alongside other changes to be addressed through operational proposals. While I will take the report largely as read, I will touch on a few points first. Our biggest submission topic was on cats, with a number of mixed and diverse opinions from submitters. Overall, there was support for our operational proposal, with some submitters feeling that Council should be going further in regulating cats, while others felt it was not the role of Council at all. This is discussed further in the paper. However, it should be noted that cats have not been identified as a significant issue in Kapiti, and regulating cats does not serve the purposes of the bylaw, which is to reduce nuisance and health and safety risks. Bees also generated some discussion, and our proposal again received majority support. It was identified that there is some confusion about what is in our bylaw and what is an operational requirement. So we are looking to add some additional information to our website to provide clarity to users. In addition to the final recommendation in this paper, due to changes in the district plan, an additional minor technical amendment is proposed for the final 2021 bylaw to amend footnotes 2 and 4 to reflect general residential zone from living zone. Appendix 2 of the report also identifies under question 3 on poultry to progress the previous question's proposal on bees. However, this should read progress the bylaw proposal to amend the poultry section and remove the specific provisions for minimum poultry coop requirements and link instead to the Ministry for Primary Industries Layer Hens Code of Welfare. I'm happy to take any questions.
Right, who's first? Councillor Elliott.
Thank you so much. My question is probably more could be answered by operational staff, and it's regarding page 34, section 7, are peacocks. And I just note that there's no provision for a person to apply for an exemption or a special consent to keep peacocks in urban areas. So what is it the operations plans people do if they currently own them and this bylaw comes into effect?
I've got no power down this end, Your Worship.
The power is all in this end.
Look, through the chair, there's a general description for staff to apply anyway as they approach the enforcement or compliance issues, and I'm confident that they apply that. Thank you, Sean. Apply that in a reasoned and balanced way. So we would be looking at all the circumstances. If it was complaint driven, we'd be looking at all the circumstances and working with the peacock owner. So there is that general discretion.
I think the power of your voice was good. Right, anybody else? Doesn't seem to be any other question. Councillor Holiday.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you. Just clarifying, with the non-urban apiaries or beehives being placed 10 metres away from public places, an exemption can be applied for as such. I think we had a submitter that was very interested in finding that out.
Yes, that's correct.
Cool. 7.5 on page 20. talks to every poultry coop of whatever size shall be suitably constructed so that poultry is confined within the poultry coop and associated run. Is that just applicable to an urban area, or as I'm just assuming that free running in the rural area wouldn't be frowned on, so to speak?
So a poultry coop would be expected to be suitably constructed for all chickens, wherever they were located. However, they don't need to be permanently confined in that coop. It's just when they are confined that it is the correct sizing for them.
Oh, okay. Rightio. So they basically can run around in your backyard as such, as long as they're not jumping the fences. Cool. Fantastic. That was me. Thank you very much.
Right. Doesn't seem to be anybody else. Would someone like to move recommendation 63 to 65? Yep. Councillor Holbrook moved. Seconder? Councillor Elliott? Right of intro?
Yeah, I'd just like to congratulate the staff on an excellent process from the pre-engagement right through to today. It's been a really well-run and inclusive process, and some really quality feedback and some useful changes made, particularly with linking to other pieces of legislation and rules. So thank you very much.
Debate. Anybody? Councillor Holliday.
Look, just want to support Councillor Alvaro's views. I think I mentioned this at the briefings that we have at Ashton. You've been absolutely fantastic with regards to how you've articulated and the information you've given to us. So thank you very much.
Right. I can just add one little bit. You've made an elegant fix, really, to this angst people felt about feeding feral animals from an animal humanitarian perspective. So that was good. Right. It's been moved. Councillor Holbrook, seconded. Councillor Elliott. Recommendation 63 to 65. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against, carried. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is the update on the Three Waters reform. Can the Chief Executive, while Sean comes up, give some your views in the torrent of emails we've been receiving?
Not really, as I'm not an elected member, and thus I'm not enjoying the receipt of them. I do understand that around the country there are auto-generated emails being sent to all elected members. Taxpayers Union, I think, are behind most of them. No, I'm sorry, I can't really comment more on them. I don't know if you want to, Sean.
I don't really have much more to add than that, Mr. Chief Executive.
Right. They're not all from the district.
Not that I'm aware of, no. But we are looking at how we might respond or provide some assistance to provide a standard response to those. We have had previously several requests for information as to what's going on, so we have pulled together I guess a shortened sort of FAQ type response. So we would look to provide something like that back through to those.
Thank you. Can I ask the Chief Executive to also comment on the style of the recommendations in terms of noting, and then from 97.12, different. Easy one to.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So the paper today is really so there's no decision required to be made today as part of this process. So there are a number of recommendations in the report for noting. There are also a number in there that relate to the Chief Executive and our response to the government that is required by the end of play tomorrow. So the report, I guess, is a summary of the issues that are associated with the central government's Three Waters review. Their proposal at the moment, as it stands, that was provided, I think, in July, August, late July, early August, to set up 4 entities across the country to manage the country's three water assets and service delivery. the four entities. The Kapiti Coast is proposed to be part of Entity 4, so the 21 councils are proposed to be part of that. So there are a number of issues raised within the paper itself that talk about the work that we've done in advance of today to look at some of the financial implications associated with those changes. Also look at some of the issues that we've raised around mana whenua's involvement in the process to date and the concerns that we have about how that has been managed and how it might be managed moving forward. And and there's also some reference to some of the modelling on the financials that the government have provided through the Scottish Water work that's been done and the work that council has been involved in providing RFI or asset data and performance data from our LTP through into that process. But we've also had an external company, Castalia, review those modelling outputs and provide some commentary on those, which is included in the appendices as part of the report. So it wasn't going to talk any further in regard to the report, but really just it's for noting. I believe there is proposed to establish an editorial group, and the Chief Executive will talk to that to help formulate a response to government, basically setting out our concerns and what we think options might be to improve the proposal, to then be provided to the DIA as part of this process. So we've had 8 weeks basically to go through a number of workshop briefings with yourselves to look at the issues, and so that submission tomorrow will be a summary of what we've discussed and what's provided in the paper in terms of issues that we've raised. Mr. Chief Executive.
Chief Executive.
May I, through you, Mr. Chair? Yep. So I'll just chip in. All councils are asked to respond by tomorrow. We have focused on walking you through piece by piece the issues as we saw them, and including this week to try and give you some perspectives from people who have participated in the steering group all the way through too, so that you could understand their views and maybe a little bit about how they got to those views. I guess I would say that what seems evident to me is if you were on the steering group and have had 18 months to 2 years of working through this, those parties probably seem more convinced of the benefits of this change than any other council, including ours. And therefore, I think it is important that we've taken a pretty open mind to listening to as wide a range of those views as we can, without jumping to our own conclusions. As you know, from my perspective, I've tried to stress that we should keep a fairly balanced perspective and if you like, not get too hysterical about it, just walk our way objectively through the issues that we've seen. If I was to summarise what I think we've seen and what we would like to respond with, it starts with acknowledgement that Kapiti has a good track record in this space. The likes of the OAG who reviewed our water strategy have said it's considered by them to be the sort of the best practice that they've seen from the reviews they did.
We are the poster boys.
We're the poster children, if you like, for good practice. But not only that, the Castalia evidence said that our costs for the two waters, when compared to water care, are actually 10% lower than water care. So what that implies is that it can be done at a good price if you're good at your job and if circumstances have suited you. And I think that is important. Every council, every district is going to have different circumstances and they will influence their responses. There are councils, large and small, that absolutely need to find a way to make the future costs of their water more affordable. And there are other councils who say, well, I've already done that hard work and I don't want to be subsidising somebody else. But I think that the biggest opposition people have is to the change and the loss of a perceived control over their assets that they've paid for over many years. What's become evident to me this week is there's also a loss of connection that people are worried about. So it's our district, our water, we're very well connected, and I think our mana whenua express that probably better than we do, as you'd expect. And that connection and potential for loss of it to, if you like, a faceless bureaucrat in Wellington is something that people are concerned about. So our three messages will be that Kapiti has a good, strong track record in this space, and therefore we believe we should be listened to. That we have some serious concerns about the financial models in particular, but also the other non-financial issues, such as governance, ownership, and local voice. And iwi's role as mana whenua in whatever is proposed. And as a result, we'd like to ask the government to work collaboratively with the sector on a simpler solution. You've probably noted that I've tended to say in recent times, when faced with choices, we should opt for the more simple over the more complex. The cost of change with this proposal, I would have personal concerns as a chief executive, will be significant on organisations and on our three water management and supply over the next 3+ years, probably 5 at least. And that is because it's on top of many other significant changes, such as the RMA and the future for local government. So we don't want to be oppositional in our approach. We really want to stress that the government should sit down and listen to all these concerns and work through them and listen to some of the simpler ideas for how we could find an approach to the future that is affordable, equitable, and delivers the environmentally improved outcomes that everybody wants. As Mr. Mellon pointed out, because we're running along fairly fast on this, we will circulate to you a document that I've tried to complete for your consideration to be the basis of our response, which needs to go in tomorrow. I'll give you some time to have a read of it and would ask that you just provide us feedback through today and tomorrow morning on it, and that would like to, I think it'll be an additional recommendation, ask that we set up a small editorial committee just to put through any final changes, and would propose that the Mayor, the Deputy Mayor and the Chair of Strategy and Ops would help us with that. I'm sure they'll be delighted with that out of the blue recommendation. But that really what it is it's our placeholder to say, come and engage with us, and these are our views. So with that, yes, probably the last thing I should note is you'll note this is an extremely long report with more recommendations than we've seen in a year. One of the reasons for that is most councils have based their reporting on a template that was provided to us, the original of which was 42 pages long without any specific council parts in it. And so we have all tried to hybridise it and reduce it down, but that's why there's slightly longer format than what you're used to. And I felt we didn't want to deviate too much from that if we could be consistent with the rest of the sector. So that's the reason why that. And now, yeah, as Sean mentioned, be happy to take questions and comments.
Right. Can I start by looking at the paragraph 35 on the stormwater? You know, you described that we have 34 catchments, 250 projects under the 2018 long-term plan, $256 million of investment over 30 years. Councillor Hanford and I sat at the community panel for climate change last night, and we heard our consultants, Jacobs, talk about coastal inundation. Obviously, we would be looking towards greater stress on our stormwater infrastructure and assets, not only in the coastal side, but also intense localized rainfall. If this area is going to cost us a lot more money, have we incorporated the future costs into how we are responding to the three waters?
So, through you, Mr. Mayor, yeah, so the current LTP budgets reflect the full cost associated with those stormwater upgrades in the 20-year timeframe that we have presented for the long-term plan. The 30-year infrastructure strategy has those full costs associated with, I guess, 30 years of that $250 million program, and that incorporates an allocation for climate. Well, it incorporates an estimate in terms of the cost of those individual upgrades, and each upgrade itself, when it gets to the detailed design, incorporates those costs associated with the escalated intensity and rainfall that we factor in terms of our design. So yes, the current network model, and as you would have heard, as part of the coastal hazard process, inundation is also part of that in terms of the work we're looking at. But in parallel to that, we also are updating our network model for the district in that stormwater area, and that incorporates the current projections around climate change and rainfall intensity and sea level rise. So yes would be the answer to that.
The reason I ask this question is that inevitably at the climate change side, we will be looking towards be pressing for government intervention and help in those areas. I would have thought that one argument for the centralization of these assets under larger entities and government ability to manage that would include the climate change impact in the future. And therefore, there could be one rationale for centralization, but that debate hasn't surfaced as such. But that's just an academic question at this point. I'm quite happy with everything else in the report.
If I could just respond to that element, obviously there has been a lot of focus through this process in water quality issues associated with stormwater and levels of service associated with that. The flood protection aspect of it, I guess, is very site specific to some extent in terms of the extent of flooding risks that lots of councils currently either deal with or don't have to deal with. So yeah, it hasn't been raised. The stormwater area, there was a separate working group that was convened to look at stormwater, and I think they've only just reported back within the last week or so, I think, back through to the DIA. So no, there hasn't been a lot of discussion on some of those wider elements around climate cost associated with mitigating stormwater, certainly flooding issues anyway.
Right. My second question, in a similar vein, involves the Taumata Arawais, the national, I suppose, caretaker in terms of the quality of your water. Do we know the full impact of what they're proposing to impose and the budgetary impact of that in the future?
So it is. So I think the Water Services Bill is due to go back for its final reading, I think, next week potentially, or within the next couple of weeks. So we have made some allowance for that. If you recall, as part of the long-term plan process, we made allowances for additional FTEs to be allocated through to the water and the wastewater area to take on board a lot of the additional reporting requirements that we see coming from those changes. It is difficult because the bill has changed, so there was a submissions period, there was a second reading, and there's been some changes to the bill, so we don't know exactly what that will look like on the ground. And so we have allowed, I guess, some contingency because we've got additional staff allowance and some additional budgetary allowance, but there may be a need to have another look at that once the bill is finalised and we're presented with the final outcome of that. We do know, I guess, from a water quality point of view, obviously, as mentioned in the report, the drinking water standards, or the regulator, and its original focus was primarily on drinking water standards. So again, we have already allowed for the cost of compliance in the current long-term plan budgets, and have done a lot of work over the last 5 years, or 10 years actually, to upgrade the water network to comply with those standards. So I guess the area where there is probably the greatest uncertainty is around wastewater, and containment standards associated with wastewater overflows is a significant issue across the country. And again, we are in a reasonably good position there, in that the work that we've done in terms of minimising inflow and infiltration, which is a function of stormwater getting into your wastewater network. Puts us in a reasonable position. We also have, I think as is mentioned in the report, retention structures at both the Paraparumu wastewater treatment plant and Waikanai to mitigate, and Otaki as well, to mitigate that issue with regard to wastewater overflows. So when we get the bill is passed and we get some further information, we'll be able to come back and report to council on what that actually means, because we will be required to comply and report on that in advance of any new established entities. So it's likely to be 1 July, or we haven't actually got the detail as to when they will start enforcing, because the bill hasn't actually
So
passed.
there's a whole lot of information due to be feeding into this. What I'm leading up to is the critical statement, if you like, on page 45, under paragraph 65, towards the end, it says this.
1 July, or we haven't actually.
It would be premature to make a decision to opt out of the reform process,
So there's a whole lot of
and may expose the council to litigation risk. I know there's pressure from ratepayers, opinion makers, and manufactured torrent of emails is coming in our direction for us to opt out now. So could the Chief Executive explain that it will expose the council to litigation risk?
Certainly, Mr. Mayor. We would be in breach of our consultation obligations if we were to make any decision, even more so with our own standing orders having built in the requirement for us to hold a referendum, a poll of our community essentially, and then for minimum of 75% of people present and voting to vote on it. To do all of that, you would actually have to prepare the special consultative statement of proposal and undertake a special consultative procedure. So the sector has sought legal advice to clarify that this is absolutely not decision-making time. This is simply evaluate what's been given to you and provide feedback. The government says in order for them to improve the proposal. So it is not yet clear what the next steps will be. We are waiting for the government to advise us, and they say they will do so in October after they have assessed everybody's feedback. I suppose I would put a cautionary note in there and go, well, if there are going to be significant levels of feedback from all councils that are fairly critical, it's hard to see how they will very quickly come out with a response about next steps, because I think they need to do justice to analysing everybody's feedback. So don't know exactly the timing of those next steps or what they will do, and part of what we are saying is they do need to tell us how they will lead and fund consistent consultation across the country with all councils, because this is not something we've budgeted for, nor should we have. Through the LTP, we were told that they will give us guidance about how these next steps will happen, and so far that hasn't happened. So the reason we'd be up for litigation from our community would be that you have no ability to make a decision because you don't have all practicable options set out in front of you, which is the requirement. And we have not on your behalf put out a special consultative procedure to our community. This is a significant decision. The value of our assets is $548 million at their original value, and it's significant anyway because it's specifically identified as significant in our standing orders. So for all of those reasons, we cannot make any decisions at this time. If we were to try to, even opting out, we could potentially be held up for judicial review. Does that answer your question, Mr. Mayor?
Yes, it does. My last question is this. During our long-term plan process, we were given directions or advice by the Auditor General's office to consider that process as business as usual, and just pretend that these changes are not coming. Well, those are my words to the end. The rubber is starting to hit the road now. Can the Chief Executive explain how that balance, that advice bears right now?
Well, it's fair to say there has been no decision made by anybody, so therefore it is absolutely correct that we must continue to manage and maintain our three waters as our own assets. The government's intended timelines are that any transfer of assets would happen at the beginning of a new long-term plan period, and therefore in preparing the next long-term plan, if a decision has been made that the assets will transfer, you can prepare a new LTP without those assets in it. So I think we can all understand the logic of what they're saying, but we can all also totally accept, because this is what all councils said at the time, we can all totally accept the feedback from our auditors, which is that's a matter of emphasis so that your readers know that you're operating in a world of significant uncertainty, and that's the point we made. Because we don't know what things will look like in 3 years, we've nonetheless prepared a 20-year long-term plan and a 30-year infrastructure strategy, as we're obliged to do, as if we will have them for all time. So, yes, it's uncertain. It puts us in the invidious position of actually having to balance our planning and our operations in an arena of uncertainty.
Thank you. Councillor Hanford.
Cool. Kia ora. My question is kind of along the lines of the Mayor's first question, but first just acknowledging that this moment in time feels very important for positioning ourselves to be a part of the corridor which recognises the problem, the need to fix it, but then the how, and the fact that we're able to feed this in through noting where we're at and the stage that we're at now is really important. And my question in that is, obviously at this moment in time we've got that Castalia report, which is an appendix to our agenda item today, and that kind of sets out the financial implications potentially for our district. But what's the scope to get some kind of report about the social, environmental, cultural opportunities, outcomes, or potentially disadvantages, to then have that as part of the consideration as well, so we're not basing how we move forward in the conversation solely around the economics of it, but instead the kind of intergenerational outcomes, you know, either for better or for worse. So I'm just wondering the scope to get some kind of information back on that more clearly.
They require our response by tomorrow. So the short answer is not right now.
Yeah, for sure, but following tomorrow's feedback.
Acknowledging your point, and depending on what the government decides it wishes to do, what we can undertake to do is to ask the steering group and the DIA whether they have done work in that space. But we're not solely basing it on financials. All of the non-financial considerations have coalesced around 3 or 4 major issues, but there are actually hundreds of issues. They go to equity, they go to local voice, governance, ownership, iwi involvement and partnership, the way we're used to working. They go to local differences and preferences. And so I think the point you raise is valid. We can, as I say, we can ask if any work has been done in that space, and we can ask that work be done in that space if the government is willing to listen to what most councils are saying, which is please slow down. If I can sort of expand on that point, the minister you will hear saying, we've been talking about it for 4 years, so what do you mean slow down? The case for change has been made. As you will note, my view that I've expressed on your behalf is that's not really very fair or accurate for most of the country, because only the steering group has been involved for the last 2 years and only DIA has been looking at it for 4 years. That is not acceptable for councils in terms of the normal way they're legislatively required and expected to work with their communities on decisions. So slow down is understandable. I think that the government is pushing back on that as seeing it as just a delaying tactic. I think we need to focus on the why more work needs to be done and shared more widely to better understand the issue. So the impact is the same, slow down. The reasons are legitimately put forward as the why for slowing down. And they will include the sorts of things you're asking for.
Councillor Coates.
Kia ora, Your Worship. Look, I've got 7 questions, but quick fire ones.
Yep.
And I just want to
Should.
start by saying there's obviously a lot of interest around this topic, and this is the first time that we've sort of publicly discussed it. So some of the questions that I ask are in the body of the report, but already some of the feedback has come back around the size of the report and sharing it with members of the public. And also want to acknowledge Natalia and Kirsten making the effort to be here within their demanding schedules. Having iwi at the table today on this topic, I think, is really helpful, and appreciate the demands that are on them in other areas with central government as well. The first one might be a little bit around semantics, but in number 11 in the report, it says that the government has decided to, and I just want to clarify, because there is a lot of public interest in this, that at the moment they've proposed to, in terms of the bullet points set out there, and that they'll refine it from there, and that they haven't actually yet made a decision.
Yes, I'd acknowledge that. Yes, that's where we're currently at. That's
Okay.
right. It's proposed.
Thank you. The next one is around, so in looking at what we've done, do we believe that there is the opportunity to achieve the same outcomes that the government's trying to achieve under a different model?
It's a caveated yes. And why I say that is every council has different circumstances and different current and future needs. I think that many councils can move forward largely on their own, or at least with a small amount of support, preferably from a government source. That will not be the case for everyone. And so where the government wants a one-size-fits-all, I'm suggesting that actually a slightly more bespoke set of solutions would be simpler and faster to implement.
Thank you. You've already touched on a little bit on the opt-in and opt-out and the risks around that. Some councils have already publicly opted out. Why wouldn't they? What is the advantage of, other than the risks and the threat of legal challenge, which I'm sceptical would actually happen, but what is the advantage by not publicly shouting that we're opting out?
Probably the obvious twofold points. Number one, be at the table and be part of the conversation and have influence that way. And don't set yourself up to have made a decision when you're not supposed to, and to have your community say, why did you do that? Now, I'm not saying they will happen, and indeed probably what feedback we have had from our community is, as you'd expect, please don't participate in this. But I think it is important for us to try to objectively review all of it and make sure that we're saying we're still here, but we need to be listened. That's not to say that that time won't come in the future if we're given that choice.
Thank you. The next one is around the predicted cost per household, our model, projected model through Castalia versus the Three Waters model. And I appreciate my council colleague Sophie has already identified that there's more than just economics to this. There are social and environmental aspects to it as well. But could you just touch on, I guess, the variances between what it means to us, to our ratepayers financially, and what we believe we can deliver compared to the, I think it's the Wix model or the Three Waters model?
So Water Industry Commission for Scotland is the water regulator in Scotland and has been through a 20-year journey here, and is who DIA have relied upon to help them with modelling what could happen here. They have created models both at a national and at an entity level and at for every single council based on their assumptions, set of assumptions, and they have shared that model with us. Probably there are about 3 or 4 key drivers of those costs, which I can get into if we need to. But essentially they say for Kapiti Coast, if you go it alone, in 30 years' time, your uninflated costs per connection will be $2,600 odd. If you join Entity C, they will be $1,200 odd. We've looked at our own numbers because we do model 30 years out, and our own uninflated numbers are just under $900, which is around about what they are currently. So the sort of the drivers of those variations come down to the fact that Wix did not use Kapiti data to create Kapiti's scenario. And so, as you know, I'm quite disappointed by that, because our staff all over the country worked their backsides off over Christmas to respond to this date doesn't move, you provide the data because we need it to build our models. And then they didn't use it. They used the national aggregated numbers, but not the individual council numbers.
It comes back to your comment about that one size fits all, and it doesn't.
Correct. To share something a little slightly mischievous with you, my response to one of the DIA staff was, based on that model, I wouldn't buy a bottle of water, let alone transact $54 billion worth of asset transfer. So it's adequate for a very high level assessment of an issue. It is not adequate for where we're at as 67, 68, actually, if you include Greater Wellington, councils needing to assess the pros and cons financially of that. They require quite heroic things to happen. They say that our costs will be 40% higher than we say through that period, and that they will be offset by 50 to 60% cost efficiency savings. So one way to look at it is, well, they sort of offset each other, so actually. But they also assume that we will exceed significantly our debt ceiling. And then once we hit our debt ceiling, we're going to have to rate fund our CapEx. And we disagree with that assumption quite significantly, and that is the main driver of the material difference, along with assumptions about the number of water connections that we will have. So you've all been around the table, and soon you're going to look at our growth strategy, which looks at numbers of dwellings that are much higher than their assumptions say as well.
Okay, I've got two last ones, Your Worship, and quick. So you've touched just then on funding, or in terms of the financial aspect. We've talked a lot about the health aspect in terms of safer water. Can you talk a little bit more, I guess, around the funding and financing challenges for councils that actually plays a part in this issue for not just Kapiti but other councils around New Zealand in rating the capital cost of putting that infrastructure in?
If I walk all around that topic to try and answer it for you, if that's okay, Councillor. So we already, our own affordability review, every LTP identifies that in our district, our affordability is at we think, the upper edges of what's reasonable for our community overall. And we've always used the Shand report from 2008, where it said anything over 5% of a household's costs being rates is kind of the maximum benchmark. Nobody's done a piece of work more recently to update that. So we use that as a benchmark, and we're sitting around about that number when you include Greater Wellington rates. Our concern is that as elected members, you will have to make trade-off decisions which include what level of rates is acceptable, along with how much money do I need to spend on this core infrastructure. And our concern is that there will be the proposal is, by creating these large entities, the government doesn't have to tip in any money. The entities will create economies of scale that will make it affordable. Our concerns are twofold: that districts will not have strong input into managing those costs to make sure they stay affordable, and therefore, because the water rate will be collected by an if you like, an aggregated, slightly at a distance entity, your ability to rate fund all the other activities that we do will come after that. And this council will be under even more pressure to reduce its rates in all its other areas, because water rates are going up by a lot if the Wix model was to be believed. As it happens, our own modelling has our debt at well under 200% debt to revenue in 30 years' time, which includes $1.1 billion worth of capital expenditure. So we believe that we have prudently budgeted in to manage these assets and still keep us on a very sound financial footing, and have worked towards the environmental standards uplift that we anticipate. Based on that financial modelling, we'd have to have got it wrong by 300% to match the numbers they say we'll be at. And I really struggle to see how that could be justifiable.
I want to expand that a little bit further. I'm sorry, colleagues, but because you've talked previously around the 500 million that the government poured in each year, so maybe if you just elaborate a little bit further on that in terms of addressing the funding issue, and then that's fine.
So in tranche one, the government put in 761 million to councils, and they said this is a kind of an acknowledgement that funding and affordability is one of the main concerns, and we'll give you some money and we'll ask you to do something that's not currently budgeted, which wasn't that helpful, as in it could be in a future year, but you have to bring it forward and do it on top of your planned work program. Then in the current financial year, they put in 296 million, I think was the number. So over the 2 years, they have put $1 billion aside for local government towards the three waters. What they're saying in this proposal is, but we're not going to put any money into your sector going forward. You're going to pay for yourself in the waters. What I'm suggesting is that if they've managed to put in, on average, 500 million a year for the last 2 years, that's a darn good starting point for helping those councils that have issues with funding their current requirements. And that if that was to continue as a starting point, and I do suggest, and it would grow from there over years, but as a starting point, that would totally fit with what we previously suggested to the Productivity Commission would be a good solution for the sector. That something like 500 million a year would be a good starting point to help with those affordability concerns. And I further suggest that it shouldn't be shared equally, it should be shared on an equity basis. So those councils, largely the rural ones with the very small ratepayer bases and multiple water schemes, are probably first in line for a bit of support, and that once you support them, it's only it usually works out at only a few $1 million a year for them. And Kapiti, if it truly can go its own way at the moment, shouldn't be worried about that. We should support that. So a far rate that recognises equity and is variable for equity is what I think we should suggest. And a good starting point would be just continue with the amount you're setting aside and don't tell us you can't afford it.
Councillor Holbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you. Yeah, this certainly is an important moment in time, but the first of many important moments in time around this, I think, in terms of making decisions around this at the council table. But it's an important moment in time from other points of view too, you know, in the bigger picture. And I just wanted maybe some comments around the timing of this reform around other pieces of legislative reform, particularly thinking of the Future for Local Government reform and the RMA reform.
Pretty soon I'm going to chuck to Sean, so give him, he might be itching to jump in here. Pretty much all of the sector have said you have put the cart before the horse, that the Future for Local Government should be the starting point, and once you've decided what you do, then you decide how best to do it. And everyone acknowledges that to the councils, it looks like the government has tripped over the fact that the three waters and RMA reforms are going to significantly change our sector, and therefore we better have a look at the sector and see what it should be doing. And that's been pointed out for over 2 years. The government, and understandably, wants to finish this piece of work and has said we are not going to slow it down to get the horse before the cart. So at risk of killing metaphors, they're flogging the horse. And I don't know about everyone else, but on behalf of our organisation, this horse feels pretty flogged and is concerned about the cumulative impacts on our ability to keep doing our job with all of these reforms, with a really, and it's been acknowledged by DIA staff, a reformist government with the mandate in terms of a more than 50% representation around the government table to do what it likes. And we just feel that we can see the why, but they are not at the pointy end trying to make these things work. We all agree for the needs for safe drinking water. We all agree with improving our environmental freshwater receiving environment. We all agree and desire RMA to be dramatically improved. But I think that these issues individually and collectively are way more complex than people, if I may say, sitting around a desk in Wellington Central have a handle on. I'll go back to a naughty tale, which is when the earthquakes hit, Bill English didn't understand that councils did civil defence and emergency management. So the point I'm making with that is I think there is a real lack of understanding of what councils do, how interwoven and complex they are in your decision making is these days, and our workers. So we would like them to come and walk in our shoes for a while before they make these calls. That would be really helpful. And when I say walk in my shoes, I really mean walk in my shoes, not come and sit here for 5 minutes, ask us what we're doing, and go away going, oh, I don't know what you do, but I've got the intent of it, which is what I heard one central government chief executive say.
Yeah, this legislation does feel like the councils are like horses being led to water. But, so I just had another question about, so we talked about how our council is doing quite well in the water space, but having been around this space for quite a while, I'm acutely aware that that happened against political drive from the community, and that it was a brave decision by that council to make decisions that have led us to where we are now, and that might not necessarily have happened if it wasn't for actually the council at the time resisting political pressure. So you've talked about how removing the charging from local councils is a disadvantage in terms of being able to charge what they like and not having that political pressure to spend less or to go with different models. So in terms of our feedback, are we providing any kind of options around how to depoliticize water decisions so that they're made around safety of supply, sustainability of supply, rather than that pressure to reduce costs and other political pressures that can happen?
Maybe I'll start. Sorry. Maybe Sean will talk more about that background with the water metering because he lived through it, and the whole water strategy. But your last point actually is a key point that I feel we're making, which is that in the 4 years since Havelock North, the simplest solution to safe water, as I understand it, would have been to mandate chlorination of water. The cause of it was that there was no disinfectant treatment in the water, and with everything else that went wrong, that probably would have prevented this problem. And I know because the chief executive at Hastings at that time said we truly believed we had the best water in the country. Now, if you listen to the language around the country, there are a number of councils, and one in the South Island who is very, very loud, saying the one thing we don't want is to have to chlorinate our water. We've got beautiful, pristine water. So I have a real concern that in the 4 years the government could have mandated that. It could have set up the regulator fast and mandated that, taken that away from being a council by council decision, and we wouldn't have a water problem today in terms of the risk, or at least would have a far lower risk of water contamination causing illness and maybe death. Similarly, most councils hate the idea of introducing water meters. Currently, New Plymouth is having the exact same debate that we had back then. Exact same issues are being raised, and I really feel for them because we can stand up and say we've seen the benefits, and they are having people with the same concerns. So I think that, back to your point, there are things that the government could do, and they are not big bang changes. They could mandate some of these things that would improve the world, and we could talk about which those things are, but we need to know that across our country, some councils are going to oppose it violently. That is the current issue. So I have concerns that they're talking about a great big change instead of some of the small steps that could have been made.
Councillor Elliott?
Thank you. Nice segue into what I want to talk about, which is referendums. So thank you, Councillor. As a result of all of the public outcry and concern that was expressed when water meters were being installed and the request for a referendum, we now have 0.916 in standing orders that protects our public ownership of the water supply by referendum. And it's right here, and it's really special, and it was the people power that made that happen. So Wayne, I just want to get some clarification about how this is applied. It's my first question, and that is that if we, as far as I understand, if we, when the time comes, opt out, surely that is not going to trigger anything like this because the referendum, because there wouldn't be any change to the current situation. So it's not really meeting the requirements of points A to F. If council wanted to opt in, then definitely that meets that test completely. So could you just clarify whether or not a referendum absolutely will happen? And also what happens if the Minister decides to legislate blanket?
Councillor, I would argue that you are making a decision, even if you decide to opt out. So status quo is effectively what the opt-out would be, and that is one of the reasonably practicable options that you need to consider. And it would be challengeable if you said, I don't want to even look at the other options, I'm perfectly happy. For a decision of this magnitude, I would certainly be advising this table that you need to undertake the full process, which includes a referendum as is set down in standing orders. You are making a decision, and if it was opt-out, i.e. status quo, that is the decision you have to have made, bearing in mind what you think the alternatives look like. So that would be our advice to you if we get to that point. Your last question, what might happen? We don't know. You're reading the media like the rest of us, and there's a lot of people suggesting that the government's just going to mandate it. I suppose I'm not going to claim to be able to read the body language and the words being used by the Minister, but it looks to me like she's starting to dig in a little bit and get a little bit grumpy with councils making so much terrible noise about this. So I can't anticipate, but I cannot see if the government was to say it was going to proceed now, I cannot see this being a particularly quiet process. So I really can't anticipate what they will do next. We will just have to wait and see.
Okay, thank you. Just my second question is probably more to Sean. You spoke about a small editorial committee being set up to fine-tune the documents going in as our response to the government. So the report we got here that we're accepting today, that is the substance of what is going to the government as our feedback? Okay. And that's exactly what we've got in here?
No, Councillor. It's essentially the two op-eds that you've seen that talk about the financial model and the other issues which have been circulated in the last 2 weeks, plus a final one which talks about our suggestions, which I ran through with councillors on Tuesday. Our suggestions for a simpler model. So it's not a. I'm not going to call it the most thoroughly researched and prepared piece of work, given the timeframes and everything else going on. It's our kind of placeholder for a conversation with government, and I'm proposing to circulate this to all of you in hard copy now. As I say, we had system problems, so we were unable to email it to you earlier, and then give you 24 hours to provide any feedback, but hopefully we won't completely rewrite.
Thank you.
I cannot let that statement by you, Councillor Elliott, to go past. I was around during the attempt to get a referendum. It was a referendum for yes or no for water meters. The referendum you are citing in terms of what we've got in the standing orders was a response by Jenny Rowan in her leadership to get rid of the argument that water meters will lead inevitably to privatization. So if you look at the standing orders as it stands now, it's exactly that, is to ensure there is no alienation of our assets or management. So there's a difference. Councillor Holliday.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. Look, most of my things have been covered, but like Councillor Coots, just wanted a couple of things to bring out a little bit, if that's all right. But just touching on what was just being talked about, and just taking in mind what Councillor Elliott and Hanford were talking, and Kent was talking about earlier, is that government could legislate this. Whether they will or not, who knows, but they could legislate it. And as Councillor Hanford said, but really if we want to influence, or if we really want to be part of the conversation to potentially what could end up being, we need to be doing that in a positive way that allows for, good information to be coming through. Would that be a fair comment?
Yes.
Cool, that's right, that's all it needs. One thing I did want to just bring out was the additional real cost to this council in regards to all the information and things that have already been done and will be ongoing. And I guess from a community perspective, really laying it out that there is real cost associated with this. This is not staff time or assets or reporting or anything that's done hasn't been budgeted for in the long-term plan as such. And yes, we have had money come through, but as you've pointed out, that's had to go to specific things. You've been able to claw some back to help that up. But there will actually be, I dare say, significant cost over the next 3 years that will have to include us sort of juggling our budget around to adhere to. Would that be a fair comment?
Yes. Very fair, Councillor. Direct costs we've managed to keep fairly low. We haven't engaged too much external work. But an example of a real cost that is going to get worse and worse in the next 3 years is turnover of staff. And there are lots of numbers out there that tell you what it costs every time a person says, I don't need this, see you later. Just because they worry about change. And it isn't necessarily just in the Three Waters space either. The whole sector has expressed its dismay is a weak word really for the advertising campaign that implies that councils are rubbish. And it doesn't really matter what they say about, it's just setting out a picture of what could happen. It's completely disrespectful of all of our people and the work that they do. And it encourage others in the community to be disrespectful. And perhaps I won't get started on that at the moment, but there's a lot of disrespect out there for this organisation at the moment being generated by a lot of people, and I don't think it's appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. On page 43, number 50, it talks to stranded overhead as an ongoing cost. I was just wondering if you could just touch on that with regards to what that is as such.
I can answer one question. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sorry. So in response to that, the stranded overhead relates to, I guess, those ongoing costs that will remain with council regardless of whether we continue to deliver those services. So the scale of our financial services, the overheads associated with plant and vehicles and buildings that remain with council, that would have been offset by rates recovered to fund the Three Waters area, where we will no longer be recovering those rates, so we will have to cover those costs as a council without having the revenue associated with the Three Waters. So I think it was mentioned at one of the briefings in terms of the number of staff. Although there will be a reduction, obviously not everything will be reduced at the same scale as the staff's direct involvement in those Three Water activities.
And I guess also just clarifying, we do get is the better off, package that's come through, but that really only lasts for about 3 years. And I think the document here had it. I think after about 2026, that figure's around the $3 million mark.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know if there's any detail as to whether it would go any further than a single year at the moment. I think it's 1 year. The stranded overhead allocation of that funding, I think, is only for a single year at the moment.
Oh, okay. Oh, great. Even better picture. Excellent. No, that's me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and we haven't really focused on those funds, but because you've opened the door, Councillor, I don't think that we will say to government we think that's a good idea. What keeps running through my head is that description of a consultant as a person who borrows your watch, tells you the time and keeps your watch. And why I say that is $1.5 billion of that $2.5 billion is going to be charged directly to water ratepayers to give to us. So why would we think that is a good idea? And they're saying, that's because we're getting the assets cheap. And I'm saying, yeah, hey, can you think that through, please, what you just said? So not really very appreciative of that part of the model, but I've held off focusing on that bit in terms of for later in the conversation.
Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the chair, that was actually quite a nice segue to bring up the 1.5 billion, because I was just about to ask about that. And it was in terms of the government released all their modelling at the end of June, start of July, in terms of their stated water bills. Then they announced a few weeks later their big $2.5 billion package, with the 1.5 billion being borrowed from future water rates. So presumably that 1.5 billion hasn't been factored into what they propose those bills will be in the next 30 years?
Yeah, correct. That's, our understanding is they came up with the idea, but they haven't changed the models at all since that point. So it's not in there.
Cool.
And it also, it doesn't actually relate to even delivering on the issues associated with Three Waters in terms of the environmental, the safety. It's not to be funded towards the Three Waters activity, is my understanding. It's for other work outside of that. So the $500 to $750 million that was put up in terms of the cost of solving the water issues is, again, outside of that. It's not to be used for that work as well.
Ping pong. Interestingly, I suppose I'll share an interesting comment that I heard, which was these entities are being set up and told you will not make a profit and you will not pay a dividend. The government has actually described that one-off $1.5 billion as a one-off dividend, on the basis that more than that will be saved through the entities in future. I imagine most of us would say, well, if you're truly going to save that money, then don't charge ratepayers. Let them benefit from that saving, and or dip in your own blimmin' pockets and pay us for our own assets.
I'm sure there's two gentlemen known as Peter and Paul who the government could talk to about that. Do we know how many councils have actually opted out rather than being reported to opt out? Because I know Christchurch was being reported to have opted out, but me, being the giant pain in the arse I am at times, ended up tweeting with the Mayor of Christchurch yesterday, and contrary to the reports that were saying they opted out, she said, "We haven't opted in or out as we have not been asked to do so," which is exactly the point and I've seen other council reports have the exact same recommendations. But then she adds, if we were, and based on the info we have, we would recommend to our community that we opt out. So is that sort of the position that a lot of those councils that are being reported as having opted out have actually said this? They've said, we're not formally opting out, but if you run with this as is, then this isn't something we'd recommend to our community?
I certainly can't give you exact numbers. We all know that Whangarei has opted out, but it's pretty important to note that they say they have provisionally opted out, and if somebody gives them information to change their mind, they would consider that. So it is a positioning statement as much as anything. I suspect that all other councils who reported as having said they're opting out have probably taken a view along the lines of what you've said, but it would be dangerous for me to say definitively. And as we know, perhaps yesterday's interesting bit of news was that Timaru Council has withdrawn from LGNZ, which is not opting out of the reforms. They have withdrawn from LGNZ, saying that that organisation is not adequately representing them.
Yeah, that was a bit of a surprise when I saw that news yesterday come through. My final question is just going back to that a point you made earlier, Wayne, which was around the Minister's view hardening. And is that something that I sort of followed Parliament this week, and she's had questions? And I know yesterday she was asked about the whole whether a regional model had been considered rather than the big multi-regional model. And she seemed very much to dismiss that and say they'd looked at it and basically it wasn't viable. So I guess, is the risk here that it's going to be this way or the highway in terms of the size of the entities, and we're sort of getting left with a Hobson's choice over this?
Yes. So what they tried to do was not unreasonable. They tried to create a subset of local government representatives for the last 18 months to 2 years to help them through working out what the best model would be. The problem is that completely contradicts our legislative requirements for ourselves to be aware of and understand all practicable options. And so I think, again, and it isn't really a lack of understanding as much as an intent to, they accepted that all councils said, we can't be involved in this, because the people who were involved were meeting for at least one whole day a week at one stage. And all councils could not have provided resource into doing that. as you can see from the views around the country, that would have been an impossible meeting to manage anyway. So the intent wasn't bad, which was create a subset of people who are going to work through this on behalf of everybody and come up with a good outcome. But it runs headlong into the reality of we actually need to understand all those options and why you have discounted some. So they absolutely did look at a regional sized model and other variations. I think they had 13 models that they modelled up before they came down. The whole sector is still saying, nonetheless, you now need to walk us through it because that's our right and our requirement.
Perfect. Thank you.
Councillor McCann.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm really following on what Councillor Compton is leading to, and it's probably just some quick fire answers just to clarify the long answers we've had, Mr. CE, is that one of the things you are advising us to is that we should not be trying to opt out because that poses the option of trying to work collaboratively.
It does. We state our position up front. We may not get a chance to talk, and by the way, it may be done to us anyway, in which case we look a bit silly.
It's a perfect short answer. And for the general public who are listening, they'll be aware that perhaps councillors have been spending a lot of time having briefings, and one of the ones that we had on Tuesday, and I think it was only Councillor Elliott and Randall who weren't participating, was that we talked about what your response might be. So while we haven't seen the written form of that, we as a council group have discussed the various elements. So the quick question is there anything that we didn't discuss on Tuesday that we're about to see in the written document?
No, sir. As I said in my piece of the intro, we believe we have a good track record and therefore are entitled to be heard at any table, that we have significant concerns about the proposal, certainly for Kapiti Inc., and we're unable to evaluate what it means for NZ Inc. And therefore, we would like to suggest a simpler way forward. That's the essence of the message, and it talks to governance, ownership, a little bit about iwi, local voice in two areas. The high-level strategic, will our growth aspirations be funded? And the low-level service levels, will our pipe bursts be fixed as fast as we're used to? And can you please talk to us?
That was almost a really short answer, but it was really good.
No other questions. Sean, I know you've got some other things to add to the long recommendation 97.
I think there's a further recommendation that relates to the editorial committee, as I understand it. That
so can I just split it and take this on first? The 97,
sure. And
then we add that it's a 98. All right?
Certainly.
So would anybody want to move recommendation 97? Yep. Yeah, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, thank you. There's a double up on this. 97.12.16, 17 and 18 is exactly the same as 97.12, 13 and 14. It's just an editorial amendment, but
Councillor, that's in our report, I think, isn't it? And so we won't amend it. It was just an error, yes.
Cool. The only other thing was 97.2 notes that August 2020 agreed to enter into Three Waters Reform Memorandum of Understanding and Funding Agreement with the government, which resulted in the council receiving funding of 6.26 million. Whether we could say that was non-binding. Just clarifying that it was non-binding more than anything else. Just so people don't think that there was any rules or anything attached to that with regards to an opt-in, opt-out option as such. 97.2. Even just, I guess, at the end, just adding which was non-binding. Would that be adequate? Thank you.
Councillor Holbrook,
I'm very happy to move these recommendations.
as amended.
I'm just wondering how we deal with the hard copy of the report that's going to be presented today. Would it be possible to table that report so that it forms part of the record of this meeting? So
Yes,
that
there'll be 98.
98? Yeah, okay. Where's 98? Can we have that?
But we're going to move the 97 separately as amended and then go to 98.
Sure, but 97.15 actually refers to that, I think. It refers to the feedback. So I was wanting to know what's in 98 so that I can add stuff to 97.15 if necessary. So 97.15 says authorises the Mayor, the Deputy Mayor and the Chief Executive to update the Council's feedback to the Government following the meeting on 30th of September. Yeah, that's good. Very happy about that. I also wanted to put in there that also following feedback from other elected members within 24 hours. Because we have agreed to that today. Yeah, and I just wanted to ensure that this feedback does form part of the record of this meeting. That was all. Councillors.
So we've got the 97 as amended, and I can move those, and then the 98 separately. It's in there already, isn't it? Okay, you happy with that?
Yep.
Right. Yes.
Just on that, we've still got two councillors who.
No, I'll ask Councillor Randall if he's got anything to say.
Well, can I make the point?
Yeah.
Just can I make the point that it feels to me that we need to allow coffee breaks so the two councillors who were neither briefed or have read this have an opportunity to ensure that they agree with the document as a whole, as opposed to trusting on faith, because their wording, they're allowing feedback, pretty vague, and if we've got two councillors who haven't had the opportunity of being in the briefings, they might not agree with the direction. It just feels like we're...
So we've got two councillors who are not there. There's Councillor Elliott and Councillor Randall. Councillor Randall is, we can only email this. So we have a difficulty because that's collapsed. He's working.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, I can hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah, I mean, I was on medical leave on Tuesday. That's why I was not present.
Yeah.
And I actually sent an email to the staff telling them that.
No, we have accepted that you're zooming in.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what's the problem? I've got no objection to the recommendations.
No. The only thing is Councillor Rob is saying he wants, because you're not here at a previous briefing, he wants to send you the current document that's been tabled for you to have a read and say you've got no objections to it.
Can I, may I, Councillor Randall, may I just, sorry, speak over the top of you, but Councillor McCann, nobody's had this hard copy, so to be fair, we'll be pretty flexible because this is not a council decision, this is a council document, so I would not like to clog our arteries and slow ourselves down. We've got a couple more significant papers, or at least one to go through. With your leave, I'd like us to pass the resolutions and be very flexible as much as we can with any feedback from any councillor by tomorrow, with your leave and through the chair.
Right, is that...
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. So I've got questions now on
Just a really quick clarification.
Councillor
So
Hanford.
Is this the op-ed as well? This is both the feedback and the op-ed that was spoken about on Tuesday?
Yes, Councillor, as I said, under the urgency of time, I found it simplest to go, well, this is what we've already said. We'll
Nice.
just pull it together as our submission, just in case they haven't read it.
And then we can publish it as an op-ed as well.
The final piece will be published next week, probably. We're still working through those details. I've had some suggestions that we should actually strengthen our language a little bit in our op-ed, so we'll work through some of that detail. But
Councillor Elliott?
Thank you. Just quickly, I wanted just some clarification of when it would be publicly available and how.
Chief Executive?
2/3 of it has already been put in Kapiti News. The final third is what we just referred to that we hope to publish next week under sort of the council's name, probably.
Councillor Pravanov?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. So obviously we have a hard copy here. Councillor Randall is going to be sent an email. Are we going to be sent emails as well? And I'm just wondering how, when we respond, whether or not, how that's going to be collated so we all know what the responses are, please.
Yes, I imagine we'll put it on LG Hub as we usually do, and we'll just ask you to email in to us, probably to the Dem Services mailbox. I know they'll really appreciate that suggestion, all of your changes, and then we'll just collate them as best we can, but it may be a little bit post the fact. We'll just have to see how much time we have available tomorrow.
Is LG Hub the best mechanism versus sending an email that's got track changes in it by everyone?
Not really. Just a high level feedback.
Okay.
Comments. People can see comments.
Right. Look, somebody would like to move as amended recommendation 27, the whole law. Councillor Holbrow has moved it. Can I have a seconder? Councillor Rob McCann. Right of intro.
I think we've had quite a long discussion about this today, and we've got lots else to get through, so I won't say very much. I just want to thank the Chief Executive and the Group Manager of Infrastructure, also the finance team for the enormous amount of work that they've been doing over the past 8 weeks to try and understand this huge piece of work. And also I just want to acknowledge the huge amount of uncertainty amongst the staff that must be occurring at the moment with these changes coming up, and just want to send our best wishes to everybody during this time. Best wishes. Thank you.
That's really good. Councillor Compton.
Yeah, I first want to acknowledge the work that staff have done on this over the last, several years. We've been working on it really because it's had a long lead and it's still got a long way to run, depending on what happens in the next few months. I think in terms of my perspective, it's across the sector. We all accept that something needs to change in the way that we fund and deliver this because the current model isn't going to be sustainable in the long term. The big question is about how you do that, and that's where all these pain points are coming, because I saw yesterday some Wellington City councillors were very vocal saying that this is a great idea, and I can fully understand why, because if you've got $5 billion for Wellington City, I think, and pipes that need upgrading and repairing and replacing, of course you're going to be happy to give them away and get someone else to deal with them. But it's a very much different situation for every council, and this is part of the challenge we're facing here is, I guess, the pressure to chase purely cost efficiencies and big levels of cross-subsidisation versus what actually works appropriately for each community. And there will be no perfect answer, but I hope that despite the Minister's comments this week that seem to be hardening up the position on that this is the model and nothing else, I hope that sort of the feedback that the sector is giving, and 99% of it is in good faith and has been well informed, is actually listened to, because I think, as Councillor Holbrow said earlier, this has become a giant political football, and if it's not managed carefully going forward, it just will become intractable, and I don't think we want to get in that position, because that would jeopardise any other reform to the sector that we want to get through as well. So we're at a really crucial stage here, and it's sort of fingers crossed we get listened to, and I think staff should be commended for the great work they've done on this, and I think the really sound advice they've provided at this table.
Thank you. Councillor Coates.
There's already been acknowledgement of the work that the staff have done to get us to where we are today around the reporting and the RFIs and so forth. What I actually want to go back a bit further than that, and that's to acknowledge that the work that was done by staff in previous councils to get to the strong position that we are in today, to be able to say, actually, it can be done. And we've shown that it can be done, and not as a large, wealthy city or community, but just through prudent management and good decisions. I think it's fair to say that many of those elected members that voted for water meters no longer had a seat around the table in the training that followed from that. So, what that says is sometimes you have to make a stand and make brave decisions for what you believe is right, not what's popular. So I want to acknowledge that because I think it does give us a better platform in terms of speaking to the government about what we think is achievable. I also want to make the point that I think that I personally have some grave concerns around the voice that iwi have in this discussion. This is not our gig. This is not our project. And we're not resourced, and nor are we expected to, but in some ways are having to respond to this. And we're repeatedly told by the government that we've got this, that we're engaged with iwi, and so forth. And, in the recent briefings, I think there's some cracks showing there in terms of some of the questioning I asked around iwi's involvement. And so I do want to kind of publicly state that I've got concerns around how much or how little that they have had the opportunity to be involved, also acknowledging the capacity or lack of capacity that iwi sometimes have with the demand that is on them, not just on Three Waters, but on a range of issues that face the country. Like Councillor Compton said, I accept that change is needed, more in some areas around the country and less in others, but the case for change, I think, is clear. And for me, it's just a level of how much it is and what it means to Kapiti. And as an elected member, we all swear an oath to work in the best interests of Kapiti as a district, and not in terms of New Zealand, which is essentially what councils are being asked to look at is around, and I think the Chief Executive uses the term, what's good for New Zealand Inc. And so from my perspective, in terms of fulfilling my role around what's best for the community, we have to work hard for what we believe is the best outcome for this community. We need to be mindful of the bigger picture. We need to take that into account. But I think the bottom line for me as an individual is what's best for my community, and does that fit into that what's best for New Zealand. And I think lastly, just wanting to make the comment that whatever we do, and at the points that we have to make decisions, that we ensure that the community has a voice and that they have an opportunity to be heard. It's been incredibly challenging, I know certainly for myself, and I'm sure other elected members, where it's been difficult to engage, and there's been the desire or the thought to do surveys and engagement and so forth, but then, if it's not meaningful and there's no kind of purpose to how it's used and delivered, then there's no point. So at some point there needs to be an opportunity for the community to have a say on this, and not just through the Ratepayers Union, I might add. So that's it from me. Absolutely support what we're doing today.
Councillor McCann.
Thank you through you, Mr Mayor. Yes, I can only acknowledge all the things that have been said by my fellow councillors as being very wise and well thought out. And I would like to thank all of those people who are personally writing me letters at the moment. And I do want to acknowledge to them that we are considering these issues, and we have been considering them in a way that we're not having a knee-jerk reaction. I think every councillor around here knows that there is a problem with water, and especially the future of water as it becomes more of a scarce commodity. And it will continue to get worse unless there is significant action taken. We're all aware of the problem. Where we differ is on what that solution might be. And one of the things I know we've talked around at the council table, and it was mentioned by our Chief Executive, and I concur entirely with this scenario, is that effective enforcement has been entirely lacking around water. And is this a reaction to that ineffective enforcement over many decades? I do suggest that in some ways it is, and that is one of the answers that the government has put forward. And the other part of it is removing the politicalisation of funding. But in effect, by doing that, funding decisions no longer affecting whether councillors and or councils remain popular or in their jobs doesn't actually change the deck of the Titanic, so to speak. Ratepayers are still going to pay for these changes, albeit through a different mechanism. And that's certainly borne out by the evidence that we've been provided by a number of experts. There's another really important argument, and we've heard it multiple times about the New Zealand Inc. And we have, as councillors discussed, where our first priority is, which is to our ratepayers. But at the same time, we also have to look and understand that if we can't look at the bigger picture, then the government simply says, well, you've failed in the job of looking at what's best for New Zealand, we'll take it off you. And when we look at the environmental changes that we put in place, often the argument that we use is we need to demonstrate to other people the way in which we need to behave. And ironically, in the space of water, we have demonstrated that. While I was not a member of those brave councils that took some of those steps, we have demonstrated a really good understanding of the concerns that there are in water and the pressures in water. So we've led some of that, and I say we, I'm often guilty of that. Previous councils have led that work, and this council continues. So I'm really happy with the very considered response that is listening to all of the people who are personally emailing all of us, and making sure that we are still remaining at the table so that we can work collaboratively. Because in the end, we want change to occur, and we want to be part of that, rather than just opt out and have it happen to us. So I'd really like to commend the staff on the work. So often, sometimes staff will be commended on work that we agree with, and then passionately told that they're not doing the work when we don't agree with them. So we need to stop that practice and just acknowledge the extremely hard work and the competency that has been demonstrated here today.
Councillor Hanford.
Yeah, not much to add after that very impassioned response to the report today. Thank you, Councillor McCann. Yeah, 100% tautoko all of my fellow councillors whakaaro on this, and how right now we're obviously at a point where it isn't just a yes or no, and this is a shifting and complex conversation that we're wanting to approach relatively simply with a simple alternative, which I think is a really great way to engage our community in this conversation too, because I know how overwhelming it must feel for the community as well to be exposed to all of this information, but then for us to be able to provide some leadership in kind of an aspirational way by making sure that we're remaining open to the conversation, both with our community and with central government, in a way that really focuses on outcomes. So yeah, I guess I just really want to set the precedent for being in this conversation in a way that's respectful, that's aspirational, in a way that delivers on needs and aspirations, that focuses on the why. And thank you, Chief Executive, for also acknowledging that, and how the simplicity of this all of all of this could actually potentially be the best way for us to deliver those outcomes and that aspiration. So kind of tautoko Councillor McCann's sentiment too, that there is a problem, we need to fix it, and we need to be focused on the how. And the fact that we're stepping into this corridor, you know, with an alternative and not just kind of bagging the whole thing, but we're actually saying this is how we think it could be improved and strengthened for those outcomes and for the reason why change needs to happen. So I'm fully in support of the approach that we're taking, the words that are being used, and the continued focus on equity and environmental outcomes. So thank you.
Councillor Holliday.
I am going to keep it simple because I agree with everything that's been said. I just wanted to echo Councillor Coote's views around iwi, the Kapiti Inc. versus New Zealand Inc. as such. And I want to assure our community that we are keeping ourselves informed as councillors. We've had numerous briefings on this. There's been plenty of information out there which we've read, and this has been ongoing since October, and I think will be ongoing for a wee while yet. So we're not burying our heads in the sand, but I think it's very, very important that we do keep the narrative positive but firm. As Mr. Maxwell has said, you know, we've got to we've done very well in this space, and that is and much thanks. And I will mention ex-Mayor Jenny Rowan and her council, but also the council officers over the years, that our water assets are in very good condition, and the sacrifices that have been made for that should be acknowledged. And I think you know, there are potentially ways that this whole process can be modified by the lessons that we've actually been through and learnt with quite a lot of sacrifice. I thought it's also important to note that government is quite removed from this as a process, and what I mean by that is that we find that councillors are and council officers are the frontline people in this. We're the ones, as we can all attest to, our current email boxes, which are slowly filling up, actually quite quickly filling up. That we're on the rock face with this, and that does mean that we feel this, we live this, and that point of removal, there needs to be some sort of connection that brings the government officials to an understanding of that and how their efforts can be capitalised to make our job easier, because at the end of the day, no matter what happens, we'll more likely end up collecting this on their behalf, even if the structure of how we pay for our water has changed. Our end user fundamentally is still going to be paying the same bills as such. But I'm very, very supportive of everything I've said and I've seen, and onwards and upwards.
Before I ask Councillor Holbrook to exercise the right to reply, mine is a very simple response. This is the beginning of the crunch time. And what I like about the situation we're in is we have not succumbed to the orchestrated political stampede that some people want to create. What we have before us is a staff report and a set of recommendations that are sober, that are rational, and provides a platform for us to engage further on this issue. That's a good place to be, given the track record that we've established. We are respected in the local government sector, so the approach that we're taking, push for more collaborative solutions, I think we're well placed, and I thank the Chief Executive and his team to have got us to this stage. The history of previous councils and their decisions, we all know the debt that we pay to them. Councillor Holbrook, right of reply.
Yeah, I just want to highlight a couple of things that have been brought up and just add a couple of things that I don't think have been mentioned. So, yeah, tōtoko the concern around iwi involvement here. This has started out as such a huge opportunity for co-governance and meaningful involvement by mana whenua across our country. And it seems to be floundering just a little bit. And I just hope that can be brought back into a really strong kind of piece of work. One thing that hasn't been mentioned is the impact of climate change on our water infrastructure across the country. 2019 estimated around $14 billion worth of at-risk infrastructure across New Zealand, and the vast majority of that in the water space. So that adds to this kind of case for change, and I don't think that's been mentioned kind of enough through this discussion. And I don't think anybody's arguing against the case for change. But I do think that with this whole process, the horse is kind of bolting, and there seems to be this the discussion, the conversation seems to be out of control a little bit, and I'm a little bit concerned about bringing it back to, we all want the best outcome. We want that equity of supply, we want that sustainable and quality water right across the country. It's interesting that the far north were identified as one of the councils that were most likely to benefit from this, and yet they've provisionally opted out. And I just look back at the minutes of the council meeting and they have provisionally opted out. It's not just through the media. So, and LGNZ have been in a really difficult position through this too. They've been working through all these options, working for some years now in the water space, because we all did realise there was a problem. And now we're in a position where there's this kind of fear of change, this fear of seizing of assets, this fear of lack of local control. And I congratulate our Chief Executive on coming up with some pragmatic and sensible solutions rather than just pushing back against. And I think that's really valuable. It's a well-considered response, and I think the debate around the table too has been well-considered. And I'd like to thank my fellow elected members for having such deep understanding and such a well-considered response to this. I just worry that the general understanding in the general population is not realising the scale of the problem, the scale of the at-risk infrastructure that I talked about, also the infrastructure deficit across the country. I mean, we heard through the water meter debate, it falls from the sky, it's free, why do we even pay for it? You know, and I think that's an education piece that needs to happen more strongly. We've talked about the regulator, Te Mata Arawai. None of us argued against that. We all want to bring our water standards up, you know, and that there's going to expose a whole lot of problems, but then it's how do we fix them? And is this the best way? Councillor Handford talked about, you know, is this the only solution? Is this the best solution? So I want to thank my fellow elected members and for the staff that they've done on this, and I recommend all these many recommendations to everybody.
Right, thank you very much. Recommendation 97 in subsections altogether, moved by Councillor Holbrook, seconded by Councillor McCann. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Councillor Randall. Okay. Yes. Have you got them? Yeah. Okay. Those against? Carried. Thank you very much, and we need a break. Yeah. Just 10 minutes, we'll be back at 11:30. All is all.
Yeah.